I'm talking to Brantley, my grandson, in regard to memories of World War II. I served in the United States Navy and was in service during the war for approximately 3 years. And I took my basic training at Little Creek, Virginia, at the Naval Academy there. And after graduation and from the basic training, I went to Philadelphia to wait assignment to a ship, and was assigned to a LSM, which is a landing ship medium, which was one of the ships of the amphibious group that was operating in the South Pacific. And we picked up our ship in Philadelphia, or better yet, at the Navy Yard in Delaware. And we had our first, what we call a shakedown cruise, off the coast of Virginia, North Carolina. And then after we had the shakedown cruise, and that was for the purpose of finding anything out wrong with the ship, we then left and went on through the Panama Canal and up to Lido Beach, California. At that point, they stopped and we began to take on ammunition, and they put different types of machine guns and quad 40 guns all around our ship. And when we left Lido Beach, we looked like there was machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns all around us. So when we left Lido Beach, California, we was heading for Pearl Harbor. We got to Pearl Harbor, and of course at that time it was during the war, and Pearl Harbor revealed us very much the scars of the December 7th raid on Pearl Harbor. Several of the ships were still partially underwater that was hit by the Japanese on December 7th, which is the day we remember as Pearl Harbor Day. We stayed in Pearl Harbor and took on supplies and more guns and more ammunition. At that time, we put a quad 40 caliber gun on the bow of our ship and give us more firepower. And then we headed toward the South Pacific. From Pearl Harbor, we went to a little island called Inuiatak. Incidentally, that island is still in our possession and under U.S. control, and is a very important cog in the South Pacific traffic today. The little island of Inuiatak, we saw nothing there, of course, except it was just a place that we could refuel and go on, but we kept plugging on, and from there we ended up in the islands of the Philippines, and we worked the islands of the Philippines several months, and we was trying to determine if there were any Japanese left on those outward islands in the Philippines. I might stop a minute to say that this LSM that I was on, being an amphibious ship, was one that could be run up on the beach and open a bow door, and then we could walk off. The method was to drop a stern anchor before we got near the beach, and then after we beached it, we could take the stern anchor with a winch, and it would help pull us off with the engine, so we could go and beach our ship, it being a amphibious ship, almost any reasonable beach. So we could go and beach and see, and etc. And we were trying to determine if any Japanese was left in those islands. And then We circled around in there for for some time, and then we left the Philippine Islands and started making our way into the real Japanese country. We left there and we went by Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was very much in battle at that time, but we did not take any part of the landing on Iwo Jima. After Iwo, we then left and was on our way to Okinawa. Okinawa had not been invaded yet, so we were assigned to be a part of the fleet that anchored offshore in Okinawa, and for days, many ships, maybe as many as 50 or 60, all day long pounded that island with every bit of gunfire that we had. And there was not a tree even left standing on that island. And so we were making preparations for the invasion of Okinawa, and we actually went in on Okinawa, but the place I went in on was in the northern part of Okinawa, and we met no resistance but other ships and other landing crafts, and their crew did meet opposition, but we did not meet any opposition on that particular landing. I might go back a little bit to the time that we were sitting offshore, pounding that island with every bit of the gunpowder or firepower we had, and not only us, other ships. And that's our first experience of running into what was known as the kamikaze plane. This was the plane that was piloted by a Japanese pilot. The plane was completely loaded with ammunition, with bombs and different types of torpedoes, and the plane would come in on our ships full speed, and the pilot would crash his plane into the ship, trying to sink our ships. And of course it was a suicide run for the Japanese pilot. Our ship did not take the hit from a Japanese pilot, kamikaze plane as they called them, but our sister ship, I was on the LSM 433, and the 432, which was our sister ship, did take a hit from one of the planes and lost several men there. Did not like to use those on the smaller ships. We still think that possibly they'd done it by mistake, but they would use them on the destroyers and the carriers and the bigger ship that was anchored off of there, of Okinawa. But after we kind of took care of Pearl Harbor and of Okinawa, and got it in pretty good shape, and took possession of it. Most of it was done by the Navy that was working in the south part. I was working in the north part with our crew, with our bunch of ships, and most of the island was already mapped by the Navy frogmen, or SEALs that they called it. They were the people that went ashore at night and tried to determine where's the best place to land, and etc. So they had all that mapped out. Incidentally, the frogmen, or the SEALs, were very important to the operation, and they were a brave bunch of men, and I still to this day would take my hat off to them because they certainly put everything at risk. But after we've secured Okinawa, we come back down to south to a place called Buckner Bay. And there's where we run into one of our worst situations. Buckner Bay on one Sunday morning in September the 25th, as I recall. And I don't recall what year it was. Okinawa was hit by a terrible typhoon. And we had an opportunity, as our commanding officer says, we could take our ship to sea and take our chances, or we could run it aground here and run it up on the shore, and the waves would probably beat our ship to pieces. So we elected to take the ship out. So we took our ship out of Buckner Bay in very, very bad sea. In fact, this was on a Sunday morning, and our commanding officer went to the conning tower, which is the control tower, on Sunday morning, and he did not come down until the following Thursday. None of us could, there was no cooking done. Every thing that was stored in bins or anything was thrown out. Our ship was a bolt of mess. We was hitting so hard as our ship come down from those waves that it would bounce our tubes out of the radios. But nevertheless, we kept our ship afloat, and we ended up several hundred miles from where we left Okinawa. We went back down to the Philippines to get repairs. We were pretty well beat up. In fact, we had needed a lot of repairs to one side of our ship that had been torn away. And so we had to have some repairs. So we was going down, went back to Subic Bay in the Philippines for repairs. And that's when we was informed that they were repairing our ship, and we were making plans with a flotilla to invade Japan, the island of Japan. Well, of course, that was a dread for everybody, because we knew that from the talk that the island of Japan was well fortified and wouldn't be easy. But before while we was in Subic Bay getting ready for that invasion into Japan, that's when President Truman ordered the dropping of the first and second atomic bombs, the first one on Hiroshima. So I was in the Philippines when the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, which effectively ended the war. The second bomb was dropped, and we was, of course, joyful the fact that we could see maybe the end of the war coming. You got to remember that we've been at sea now, the best, almost going on 2 years, with an occasional walk upon the ground if I had to have spare parts for my radios. Incidentally, I was a radioman that spent most of his time in what we call the radio shack, and most of our message was coded Morse code. Not regular Morse code, but was all in code. And so I would go ashore a lot of times for parts for our radios to keep them operating. But getting back to, we was anchored in Subic Bay when they dropped that atomic bomb. We was there yet whenever they declared the war was over. And I recall the great celebration on our ship that night when we heard the news that the Japanese had surrendered. We heard that by radio, and I was, of course, thought I would get to go home probably the next day or the next week, but it didn't happen that way. The people began to go home by the number of points they had, which was calculated by a formula, and I had enough points, but the radiomen were frozen and I could not go even though I had the points. But they wouldn't let me go because of the need of radiomen and that. So we started then to, out of Subic Bay, we went back to Korea, up to Korea, and worked in there, and we ended up in Seoul, Korea. I never will forget that we were anchored off the coast of Korea, probably not too far from the capital of Korea, Seoul. It was Christmas Eve, Christmas after the war ended. And I remember being on the radio, and I thought I would try to find a little Christmas music on the radio so that I could plug it in, and I could plug in music and it would, or anything, and it would go all over the ship because we had a intercom system aboard the ship. So I was fiddling around on the radio and I found some Christmas music. Do not know what station it was from, but I picked it up on shortwave, and I thought it would be awfully nice to plug that music into all the compartments of the ship, and all of the crew could hear it. It was Christmas Eve. And after I plugged it in, the next song that they played was I'll Be Home for Christmas. And here we were sitting off the shore of Seoul, Korea, a very bad weather night. It was so cold that the spray off the ocean was just like darts of ice when it hit you. And I remember several coming up the Radio Shack and told me to take that music off. They were homesick, so was I. And so that ended the Christmas music. So after we went through Korea, then we was ordered into Shanghai, China. We finally made our way into Shanghai, and that's where we got orders to give our ship to the Chinese Navy, and we could go home by other ships that come through. And I finally got my permission to leave the ship, and I had enough point to leave the ship, and then I returned to the States several months later and went back to Little Creek, Virginia, and got my discharge from the same place I started. And I thought it was unusual. I made the whole circle around, and I went to my basic training at Little Creek, and I was discharged at Little Creek. So that is basically a little bit of the highlights of the war. I could go into detail further, some of the men and some of the times, but usually we just feel like that the war is something that had to happen, and I've often said I wouldn't take $1 million for the experiences I had during the war, but I wouldn't give you a dime for another session of it. So if this will help you any, that's it. I got out of service. Of course, I've still maintained an interest in the service, especially the Navy, but I had several good buddies that I never could find where they were buried. I know they were killed. So my wife and I were on a tour, and we went to Tunisia, Africa, and we visited a national cemetery there. And I always checked at every national cemetery I went on several of my friends, knowing that they had been killed in service. And in Tunisia, Africa, I found that one of my good friends, in fact, he lived 2 doors from me, in the States, was buried in his body's in the National Cemetery in Tunisia, Africa. We have visited Normandy and went through again the invasion, not in person, of course, but in reality, of the invasion of Normandy. Saw on hand how they climbed the bank that was before them, the soldiers. And I guess one of the most moving times of my life was when I stood and looked over the cemetery at Normandy in France. And this last summer, my wife and I had the pleasure of touring Poland. It was completely devastated by World War II. Of course, all this was in the European theater of the war. I never got to the European theater, but all mine was in the South Pacific. But I read about them, and I went, and there was the Prague in Czechoslovakia. There was the war-torn Poland, just beyond belief of how it was bombed. And those places, it's just hard to believe how the people held on and stayed with it. And I went on up to Berlin and saw the last portion of the Berlin Wall. There's still about a couple hundred yards or a little more of it still standing. And my wife and I went to Checkpoint Charlie, which was the checkpoint between Communist Russia and Berlin. And we went through the museum that had documented all the war of Germany, and especially the building of the Great Wall there, and between Berlin and Russia. And of course, I lived long enough to see the wall destroyed. But I've had spent a lot of my time in England, and went down to the White Cliffs of Dover, and went through the war room in London that Churchill commanded the bombing from. And I've studied the war by going to places that it actually, the history recorded it. And those are the trips that I cherish in my mind, is those trips over there. Fighter plane, I cannot remember what it was, but it had that rising sunset on it. I could look it up, but I never saw one of them up close. But we went to, when we was in Australia, we went to a museum, and of course we saw the plane. They had one on display there, and I thoroughly enjoyed the Australia. And you got to remember, as we was operating the South Pacific, we met a lot of Australians. And because Australia was on the verge of being bombed by Japan too, so as the U.S. moved in, they just think that we saved their, or at least assisted in saving the situation there, and they're very grateful to the United States for the help in World War II. But the museums that's kept around in all the countries I've been to are certainly trying to maintain some knowledge or some history of World War II.